Okay, rather than waiting for a couple of truants, I'll start again on the second half of this Cook's tour of the salient landscape of Islam. I've told you about the 5 pillars, but the outward aspects of the religion of Islam, this first level of the 3 that are mentioned in the hadith of Gabriel, are not confined by any means to these 5 pillars. They overflow famously into every other dimension of the believer's life. One of the great cliches about Islam is that it governs not just one's devotional life or one's moral life, but in fact seeks to influence and guide every other aspect of human existence, individual and collective. Now, in a sense, this totalizing aspect of Islam might seem a little odd or paradoxical. I mentioned earlier that Islam does not believe in original sin. In fact, it takes a fairly optimistic view of human nature and of the human capacity to discern right from wrong without too much external assistance. We are not born into sin, the Quran says. We don't need the intervention of a divine saviour to pull us out of our categoric sinfulness. So the question arises, if the human nature is essentially decent, why should Islam bother to give such detailed guidance on so many things? What's to stop us from making our own decisions? Well, the answer is actually quite an important one. Let me give you a concrete example. Muslims are frequently asked why they should submit to a discipline of 5 daily prayers at set times. Surely one should pray when one really feels like praying. A prayer said in the middle of a busy session in the office, for instance, is hardly likely to be very concentrated or profound. Well, it's a good question and it has a good answer. Quite simply, when we least feel like praying is often when we most need to pray. Islam sees its practices as divinely tailored to the circumstances of this present age. Part of Islam's self-understanding is that it is the eschatological religion, the one ordained and designed by God for our modern needs. And this is an age, famously, of haste, deadlines, complexity. So to leave something so important as prayer to the end of the day, when one has done everything else, or to attend a place of worship only once or twice a week, is, in the Muslim view, simply not enough to keep the soul on God's frequency. We need reminding, and we need reminding constantly. The reminders don't need to be long. The prayer, as I said, takes perhaps 5 to 10 minutes. In fact, Islam's philosophy seems to be that regular snacks are better than occasional square meals. And in the light of our generation's steadily deteriorating attention span, I think there's probably a lot of wisdom in that. Everything else in Islam's pattern of practice can be seen with the same insight. We need to be reminded, and we need to be reminded all the time. In fact, it's said that the Arabic word for man, insan, is connected etymologically to the word for forgetfulness, which is nisyan. That's what we do, we forget. That's our defining characteristic. The centrifugal forces in today's world are simply too powerful for us to work out our own salvation, for us to be able to rely on our own devices. If we really wish to live our lives focused on God, but don't wish to retire from the world to live in a monastery or an equivalent, we have to have a pattern of guidance to follow. So Islam has instituted this thing called the Sunnah, which, as you'll remember from Dr. Jackson's lecture yesterday, means the normative practice, the blueprint for life exemplified by the Prophet. Sunnah is a word which means a norm or a wont. Slightly old-fashioned word, but it's the one that comes closest to it, I think. It denotes, as I said, the norm of practice exampled by the Prophet and also by his companions. And rather, as medieval Christians often sought to improve themselves by modelling themselves after Christ, the famous principle of imitatio Christi, so also devout Muslims have consciously sought to sculpt not just their souls, but also their outward pattern of behaviour on the model laid down by the Prophet. Now, this thing called the Sunnah includes the 5 pillars, but as I've said, it's not limited to it. They are its backbone. They are the basic warp and woof of the Muslim life, if you like. But Islam does go much further, and the Sunnah provides a complete blueprint for the significant aspects of human life. For instance, there's even a sunnah on how to clean your teeth. This kind of thing often seems strange to people nurtured on Western ideas of religion, which say that there's a secular and a sacred realm, and the sacred doesn't necessarily have much to say on the little mechanics of life. But we know that the Prophet used a particular type of toothbrush that was made from the arak wood, which has some herbal and antibiotic properties. And very many Muslims nowadays will insist on using a toothbrush made of the same kind of wood, and cleaning their teeth when the Prophet cleaned his teeth, which was after every meal and before every prayer. One of the sights that seems strangest to Western visitors to mosques often is the sight of men and women quickly scrubbing their teeth before they start to pray. But the sunnah, obviously, given the diversity and unpredictability of human life, cannot always take the form of specific rules. Very often, the Prophet simply issued general patterns, general paradigms of guidance. For instance, there's no immensely detailed body of hadiths on how to bring up children. Instead, we have global guidance in hadiths which say, for instance, that there are general moral principles. Famous hadith often cited is that a rough Bedouin from the desert once came to the mosque and saw the Prophet allowing his grandchildren to play on him, to climb on him when he was praying, and when he'd finished, he kissed them, and the Bedouin thought this was ridiculous, and he said, "You kiss your children? We never do that in our tribe." And the Prophet just looked at him sadly and said, "Man la yarham la yurham," which means whoever shows no love and compassion can be shown no love and compassion by God. So that's a general injunction, and the actual nitty-gritty of how you would extend that to your children is left to individual circumstances. Similarly, there are hadith which commend showing compassion and love to the elderly. I noticed that Syria's first old people's home opened only last year and was regarded not as some wonderful sign of progress, but as a very lamentable indication of the moral state of the Syrian nation, that there were some old people who simply weren't being looked after by their families any longer. I've seen this in my wife's family, because my father-in-law has Alzheimer's disease quite badly. And in most English families, he would have been hospitalized long ago because he simply cannot care for himself in any way. He can't get out of bed and so forth. But the extended family has risen to the occasion and regards it as a point of honor that the head of the family should be looked after, taken to the bathroom and so forth, fed for the rest of his days. And institutionalizing him would be regarded as very shameful. But again, detailed rulings on that can't exist. It's a general principle that's been laid down by the Sunnah. Very often also the Sunnah takes the form of prayers. I mentioned this thing called the Salat, conventionally translated as prayer, but really no less importantly for the spiritual economy of the Muslim life are the optional, more informal prayers known as dua in Arabic. Again, one of these not quite pronounceable words. Dua means prayer more in the Western sense, i.e. a petitional, improvised prayer for your own circumstances, for your family's health, etc. The usual things people pray for. Sometimes people will make up their own prayers to suit the moment. Very often they will use prayers that have been handed down from the Prophet or from his companions or from some of the great saints of the past. And I've included, I think, 3 or 4 of them in the handout, just so you can get a brief insight into the kind of prayers that the Prophet gave us. There are some prayers which one can say at specific occasions, and again it's part of Islam's concern to sanctify every aspect of human life, that there are often prayers from the Prophet for even quite trivial things. For instance, if you drink a glass of milk, the Prophet, we know, said, "O Lord, bless us in this and grant us an increase in it," as you drink a glass of milk. And so you'll see pious Muslims whispering this as they raise a glass of milk to their lips. Now, there are prayers for all kinds of circumstances. There are even prayers to be said while having sex, for instance. So the Sunnah is often stereotyped as some kind of formalistic grid that reins people in, that imposes a straitjacket which cramps the human life. But in fact, large areas of human life are subject only to general global injunctions and are not laid down in detail. It is overwhelmingly a voluntary mechanism. The 5 pillars are obligations. Most of these other things are simply optional. And optional in the formal axiology of Islamic law means something that you are rewarded for doing, not punished for not doing. And Islam assumes that there's a right and a wrong way of doing everything, rather in the way that, say, traditional lifestyles in the Far East have tried to formalize and turn everything into something beautiful, even fairly profane things like the famous Zen tea ceremony in Japan is an example of how a fairly profane, ordinary action can be turned into something that's even quite beautiful and artistic. And Islam tries to do this, to celebrate the potential nobility of human life. So Islam assumes there's a right and wrong way to do everything. And to consciously choose the right way, as explained by the Prophet, reminds us of God. That's why we do it. It's a reminding which is cemented and often represented by one of these short prayers. So that's this thing called the Sunnah. The Sunnah forms part of an even larger body of guidance called the Shari'ah. And the Shari'ah is what I'll be talking about for the rest of this lecture. Characteristically, the word Shari'ah is translated by journalists as Islamic law. In fact, it doesn't really mean Islamic law. There are Islamic laws that are included in it, but it also includes this thing called the Sunnah, which includes systems of worship, which nobody would describe as forms of law. The word Shari'ah means a way or a path. The path of the Prophet, the path to paradise. As a technical term of the Muslim religion, let me write it down. It means that body of practical assistance revealed by God for individuals and also for social guidance, for the shaping of society and its institutions. So in Islam, the religion covers not just methods of worship and systems of personal ethics, but also lifestyle and public law. Islamic law is a subject very often in the news nowadays, and most of what is said about it is seriously misguided. To start off with, we should acknowledge that, properly speaking, there is no such thing as Islamic law in the sense that there is, say, Roman law or English common law or the Code Napoleon. It's not a single codified body of positive legal rulings. What there is instead is an Islamic legal tradition which includes within it an often very diverse body of interpretations. So whenever you see a journalist or whoever saying, according to Islamic law, ... you should immediately get suspicious, because the chances are that that's just one interpretation of Islamic law that's being applied there. This can lead often to quite drastic misunderstandings. For instance, a famous case is that of domestic violence. In Islamic law, is domestic violence just cause for the woman to petition for divorce? And journalists will often say, no, it's not, on the basis of what happened in places like Pakistan, where they follow one tradition of Islamic law called the Hanafi school, which says that domestic violence is not grounds for the wife to petition for divorce. However, there are other schools of Islamic law, like Maliki law, for instance, which prevails in North Africa, the Emirates and some other countries, which says that yes, it is legitimate grounds for petitioning for divorce. Also, mental cruelty, according to Maliki law, allows the woman to divorce. So that's a warning against accepting or making large generalizations about the Islamic legal tradition. Yeah.
I was wondering about the case of Salman Rushdie. Is there some contradiction or conflict in opinion regarding his situation vis-a-vis Islamic law?
The Quran doesn't lay down any punishment for apostasy or for blasphemy. Medieval Islamic thinkers assumed that apostasy was roughly the equivalent of what we would today refer to as treason, and it carried the death penalty. In most medieval Muslim thought, that's the case. There are some exceptions. For instance, somebody called Al-Baji in medieval Spain said, no, apostasy isn't an offence punishable by law. It's something that's left to God and will be dealt with by a higher court when the culprit dies. So as usual, there is a diversity of voices. The anger of the Muslim response reflected largely insecurities about the integrity of the community and the fact that somebody from the community was now insulting it, adding his voice to the chorus of denunciations that were already being poured on Muslim values and the Muslim life from outside the faith, made people very insecure and worried, and that, I think, accounts for the nature of the vehemence. But a lot of Muslim authorities never accepted, say, Khomeini's death penalty. I remember when, at the height of the affair, and in England it was a lot sharper and more worrying than I'm sure it was in the States. I actually telephoned the highest Sunni legal authority, which is the Al-Azhar University in Cairo, where I have contacts. Spoke to the deputy head and said, what's the Azhar's position? And they said, weeks ago we issued a fatwa saying that Salman Rushdie should not be sentenced to death, and Sunni Muslims distance themselves from the fatwa and so forth. So I noted this down and contacted one of the daily newspapers in England and said, well, why don't you report the fact that most Muslim authorities, as exemplified by the Azhar, don't support this, instead of saying, according to Islamic law, ... And they thought this was a very strange story and they couldn't fit it in at all, and it was neglected. But in England at the time, we had a lot of angry sermons about Salman Rushdie, but I never heard any that upheld the Khomeini position. But to read the newspapers, you'd assume that all Muslims were determined to cut his throat. It was a very tense time. But it's an illustration of the diversity that exists, and also the fact that people can use Islamic law as a justification for their own political purposes, which is basically what Khomeini was doing. The credibility of the revolution had declined after 9 years, and in order to put himself in the center stage again, he hit on this issue. So Islamic law is a diverse and complex thing. It's also a dynamic thing. It is not a static system of law. It does have mechanisms for adapting to changed circumstances. These mechanisms lumped together under the general heading of ijtihad, which means the independent exercise of reason to amend the law or to arrive at a law where none hitherto existed. The broad parameters are still those of the Quran and the Hadith, but very often the Muslims found that circumstances arose in their lives which simply weren't covered by the Quran and the Hadith, particularly as the Muslims burst out of Arabia and came face to face with much more complex, advanced, sophisticated civilizations, legal, financial traditions and so forth, on which there seemed to be no clear guidance. This principle of ijtihad had to come up, and if I get any time I'll give you a few examples of how that mechanism works nowadays. I want to make the point that there is an image of Islam as being essentially a legalistic faith, that law is at the center of Muslim concerns. Well, if we look at the Quran's concerns, we find that only about 500 of its 6,000 odd verses are to do with rules and regulations. It's a good way of attacking that stereotype. That's the Quran's sense of proportion. The rest of the Quran is made up of statements about the divine nature, God's intervention in history, stories of the earlier prophets, spiritual lessons, and so forth. In fact, it's acknowledged that the implementable legislative verses of the Quran number no more than about 80. Clearly not enough to regulate a society. So in formulating Islamic law, the classical jurists looked primarily at the hadith, which give a lot more detailed guidance. The hadith has the function of laying down principles of substantive law in areas where the Quran is often completely silent. For instance, the zakat. The Quran says, pay the zakat to the poor. How we actually do that, the percentage of our wealth that gets dished out, is only set down in the hadith. Sometimes we find that the hadith was necessary in order to render operative Quranic prescriptions that seem to leave some questions unanswered. For instance, Islamic inheritance law, an important aspect of traditional Muslim life. In the West, one's estate is dished out by testamentary disposition. You write a will saying, I give half of my wealth to my daughter or to the Battersea Dogs Home or whatever, and you have the absolute right to do that. The Quran, however, allows you the right to dispose of only 1/3 of your estate, and the other 2/3 have to be dished out according to certain set proportions. A certain percentage goes to your wife if you predecease her, a certain proportion to children and so forth. It's quite a complicated science. Nowadays there are computer programs that work it out. Now the Quran only says that some of a deceased person's assets could be distributed by testamentary disposition, i.e. by making a will. But it doesn't say what proportion. The actual key figure of 1/3 is only to be found in the hadith. So the Quranic verse on its own is inoperative. It needs the hadith to put it into effect in society. Now there are a lot of other sources of Islamic law, and Islamic civilization developed a very original often very brilliant legal tradition, system of jurisprudence. The two basic sources of Islamic law are the Quran and the Hadith, but there are others. I'll mention just the two most important. Firstly, there is something called ijma'. Ijma' means consensus. The idea is almost a democratic principle, that if you can't find a clear ruling in the Quran or the Hadith, you look at what the majority of Muslims consider to be morally correct in that situation. And that conclusion has the force of law. It's increasingly important nowadays with improved communications. We can actually know what the majority of Muslims are thinking about a given subject. In the medieval ages, it was largely a theoretical principle. The fourth one is qiyas, which is analogy, quite a technical area of jurisprudence. If you can't find detailed guidance for a legal problem in the Quran or the Hadith, there's nothing forthcoming immediately in the ijma', then you can derive God's law by a process of analogy with an existing law. And again, I won't go into that into great detail. And there are other sources of law. For instance, maslaha, public interest, that which is in the public interest as understood and defined by the jurists, is also considered to be one of the sources of Islamic law. There's also recognition accorded to customary law, i.e. traditions, practices, conventions which are normal in society and do not contradict any of the other scriptural sources of Islamic law, are also regarded as being normative. So for instance, if a girl complains that she is not being given enough dowry, remember in Islamic law the girl gets the dowry, not the husband, that's the deal. If she says she's not getting enough and it goes to the court, then the judge will base his decision on what is normal in that particular society, on what is customary law, and will rule on that basis.
Does that mean within that particular Muslim society? I mean, because like an American Muslim, they're not going to base it on typical American society. They base it on typical American Muslim society.
Mm-hmm. Here it would be a lot more complicated. Normally Muslim societies are quite static, and you would judge what would be conventional for a woman's social background and what other comparable cases were receiving. Here it would be a lot more difficult, it's true. But then again, there are no Islamic courts here that would have to make the decision. It's very much ad hoc. I think Dr. Mir is going to be talking about gender issues, so I don't really want to steal his thunder, but this is an interesting reminder of the fact that Islamic law, really uniquely amongst the world's legal systems, attributed independent juridical personality to women. In England until the beginning of the present century, and in France until 1938, a woman lost her separate legal status when she married, and it was assimilated into her husband's. So she no longer had authority over her own wealth. In Islamic law, in all of the schools of Islamic law, a woman has absolute rights over her own property, and whether she's married or not is completely indifferent. In fact, I remember when I was working in a law office in Jeddah in Saudi Arabia, and we would have cases of husbands who were going to go to jail for non-payment of debt, bankruptcy and so forth. And at the last moment, the wife would stride into the court and write a check and stride out again, and he would be released. And the judge has absolutely no right to force the wife to do that. She's an absolutely independent financial entity. Now, the history of Islamic law, something that I will have to skate over rather briefly. The important thing to remember is that there are divergent interpretations, and that within 200 years of the Prophet's death, these coalesced into four broad traditions of interpretation, which are known as madhabs. I spelled this incorrectly. There's two H's there. A madhab, sometimes translated as a rite, R-I-T-E, because obviously it includes patterns of worship. The type of prayer done by a Maliki might be different to the prayer said by a Hanafi, in small details, whether you hold your hands like that or like that. In about 30% of the rulings of Islamic law, there are differences from madhab to madhab. There are 4 of these in Sunni Islam. And all four of these exist today, and they prevail in different countries. I'm not sure it's necessary for me to go into great detail there, except to say that in North Africa, for instance, the Maliki madhab prevails. Why don't I just write down their names, since it's fairly important. They are named after the founders of these particular schools, who were 2nd and 3rd century. Got this wrong. Jurist Shafi'i, Hanbali, last but not least, Hanafi. And they represent different styles of interpretation. For instance, the Maliki madhab attributes more importance to the practice of the city of Medina, the city of the Prophet, as an indicator of the Prophet's sunnah than it does to hadith. And so some of the rulings in the Maliki madhab will be different. The Shafi'is and the Hanbalis emphasize very much a literal adherence to the hadith, even if a hadith has been transmitted only by one person. The Hanafis use reason and also the consensus of the early Iraqi jurists more than do the other schools. But as I said, only 30% of the rulings differ between them. All are considered to be equally authoritative and legitimate. They're not sects. They don't differ in doctrine. They differ just in the little details of practice. They differ in terms of the number of their adherents. The Hanbalis are very few. There's probably only about 5 or 6 million nowadays. It's the official madhab of Saudi Arabia. There are some in Syria as well. The Malikis prevail in North Africa and West Africa. Nigeria is largely Maliki. Shafi'is are in Egypt, Syria, Uzbekistan, and Malaysia and Indonesia. And the Hanafis, who are the most numerous, perhaps 60% of all Muslims are Hanafis, prevail overwhelmingly in the subcontinent and in Turkey. And Bosnia is also Hanafi. So those are the 4 madhabs that are considered normative in Sunni Islam. And I want to use this as an opportunity to talk a little bit about sectarian divisions. In Islam, sects originated over disputes over political succession and over points of law, and doctrinal differences only crept in much later. Sunni Islam, made up of these 4 rites, accounts today and in most periods of Muslim history for around about 90% of all Muslims. So Islam has been comparatively lucky in not being too divided by schism. 90% of Muslims are Sunnis. There is a small sect which originated right at the beginning of Islam called the Kharijites, to whom you will occasionally see allusions. Nowadays, there's only perhaps 500,000 of them left. Kharijites. A few villages in Algeria, and Oman is officially a Kharijite country. These are rigorists who originated for political reasons because they refused to accept the authority of the 4th Caliph, Ali. They thought he wasn't pious enough, so they withdrew from him. In practice, you're very unlikely ever to meet any. Much more successful were the other great schismatic group in Islam, the Shia. That's the plural, the name of the denomination, a singular, one individual person from the Shia is called a Shi'i with an I at the end, sometimes partially anglicised to Shiites. Famous because the Shia are the prevailing denomination in Iran. They also account for about half of the population of Iraq, maybe a third of the population of Pakistan, the majority of the population of Azerbaijan. Those are the 4 places really where you'll find Shia. In the West, they're not particularly numerous. They have a few mosques in the United States and a handful of mosques in England, but they don't have an extensive diaspora. The point of dispute between the Shia and the Sunnis, again, is not basically doctrinal. It is to do with questions of legitimate succession to the Prophet. The Shia believe that Ali, the Prophet's son-in-law, should have succeeded him as temporal ruler of the Muslims following the Prophet's death. So we get this name Shia, which means the faction. The Shi'at Ali are the faction of Ali, the upholders of Ali's legitimate caliphate, i.e. succession to the Prophet. The Sunnis say, no, we believe that Abu Bakr, the Prophet's close friend and companion, was the legitimate first ruler, and he indeed became the first ruler. So, as you can see, it's not primarily a denominational split, it's to do with early politics. But, as is quite frequent in the history of religions, an originally political split acquired a doctrinal colouring over time, and the Shia do have certain beliefs that are distinct from the beliefs of Sunni Muslims, most conspicuously in their concept of the source of authority in religion. As I mentioned, Sunni Muslims accept the Quran, the Hadith, and a few other things like this ijma' and qiyas as the sources of religious authority. The Shia say, no, we accept the Quran and we'll accept some of the Hadith as a secondary authority, but we're really more interested in the interpretations of the law as delivered by the Prophet's descendants through his daughter Fatima, who married the Caliph Ali. And so sometime in the 2nd or 3rd century of Islam, we find appearing a theory of infallibility. 12 imams, descendants of the Prophet, who were regarded as infallible, rather in the sense of contemporary papal infallibility, if you like, that their every utterance and form of behaviour was guided by God and hence formed part of the Sunnah, was an authoritative source of law and doctrine. And this is the point at which the Shia depart doctrinally from Sunni Muslims. Sunni Muslims accept the Quran, the Hadith, and these lesser sources. The Shia accept the Quran and the utterances of the 12 Imams. The 12th Imam, a certain Muhammad al-Mahdi, disappeared. He went into a state of occultation. Again, one of these slightly uncomfortable Orientalist translations of the Arabic word ghaiba, which means disappearance. He just vanished. And according to mainstream Shia belief, he didn't die. He merely was occulted, entered the hidden realm, and he will appear as the eschatological savior of the Shia and of the Muslim world at the end of time. He will be the Mahdi, the divinely guided savior. And the mainstream Shia belief is that the hidden Imam, who is in the state of occultation, is in mystic communication with the appointed hierarchical leadership of the Shia Muslims. I mentioned that Sunni Islam doesn't have a hierarchy, doesn't like hierarchies, it's against the mentality. Shia Islam is more Christian in a sense, in as much as it has this idea of an ultimately infallible hierarchy inspired by God that mediates authority. Christianity's case, the church being the bride of Christ. In the case of the Shia, the hidden Imam being the sort of quasi-divine figure who inspires the living representatives of the denomination with infallible guidance. Also, the emphasis on the idea of a saviour at the end of time, much more important for the Shia than for the Sunnis, suggests that there's a parallel between Shiism and Christianity, which is perhaps interesting. The 12 Shia, those who accept these 12 Imams, account for the great majority of the Shia. There's also a smaller denomination called the Ismailis. They're called Ismailis because they follow the elder son of the 7th Imam Ja'far as-Sadiq, the 6th Imam Ja'far as-Sadiq, and his descendants, which the 12 Shia don't. And they don't accept there are 12 Imams. They say that the succession of Imams continues to the present day. And the main Ismaili denomination now recognizes the Aga Khan as the present Imam. He is the divinely inspired, immaculate leader. You've heard of the Aga Khan, presumably? Yeah? It's a kind of international banker with associations with the UN and big business interests, very wealthy. There's perhaps 3 or 4 million Ismaili Muslims in the world today, mainly in fairly remote places. There are quite a few amongst the Asian community of Kenya. You'll find quite a few in rural areas of India, You'll find them in Badakhshan, in northern Afghanistan, and so forth, and quite an extensive diaspora in the West. So that's the sectarian situation. As you'll see, it's complex, but not so complex as it is, say, in Christianity, for reasons that scholarship is not entirely clear about, despite the absence of a hierarchical organization that can define and, if necessary, impose an orthodoxy. Islam has been less subject to schism than has Christianity. So that the practices and beliefs taught and followed in a little mosque in Senegal, in West Africa, really do not differ from those that you'll find in a mosque in Sumatra, at the other end of the Muslim world, despite the absence of a hierarchy to hold the share together. That's all I wanted to say about sects and about the constitution of Islamic law. What I want to do now is finish off by giving some case studies of this practice of ijtihad. The great argument in the modern Muslim world and among Muslims in the West is the extent to which the classical formulations of Islamic law are still binding on Muslims. The jurists who founded these four schools of law and the commentators who endlessly wrote and extemporized on them produced this extraordinary body of normative law. Is that to be considered authoritative for all time, or do we need a new ijtihad that will bring Islamic law into a state at which it can be regarded as completely morally coherent, socially relevant, given that we no longer live in a medieval society? And basically all of the tensions within modern Islam are not over questions of doctrine, they are over this fundamental argument about the status of Islamic law. And there's a close parallel here with Judaism. The divisions that have appeared in Judaism recently are on this same point. Reform Judaism, liberal Judaism, progressive Judaism, orthodox Judaism. The point at issue between them is the status of the law. Do they follow the classical Shulchan Aruch type of orthodox rabbinical Judaism, or should there be development and accommodation? Islam is facing the same challenge, and Islam has in many ways fared no better and has been comparably divided. Christianity, obviously, there are also arguments about tradition versus modernity, particularly prominent in the Catholic Church, and amongst Christians who object to abortion, for instance. In England, we have very sharp arguments about the remarriage of divorced people in church, which the Anglican established church still doesn't accept on the basis of biblical and church authority. So this argument is not unique to Islam, but perhaps it presents itself with particular sharpness in the Islamic context because of the disproportionate importance of rulings, of rules in Islam as compared, say, to Christianity. Now, it's not clear at all exactly how this argument is going to resolve itself. As I say, it's being very sharply debated in just about every Muslim community. What I want to do is to sketch the nature of the argument as it has developed in the past 20 years or so, relating to a few specific issues. Islamic law purports to cover every aspect of life. Obviously, I can't talk about what it says on every aspect of life, but I'll give you a few case studies in the few minutes remaining to us. What I want to do is look at some issues in medical ethics. Hardly a day goes by without us seeing on the front pages of our newspapers some new ethical poser presented by new scientific discoveries. Often we English are the culprits for some reason, cloning sheep and doing strange, disquieting things to the essence of nature. How has Islamic law dealt with this kind of thing? Is it, as is sometimes claimed, a static, immobile, medieval phenomenon that can have nothing constructive to say on these things? Well, I'm going to suggest that in fact there have been some interesting arguments, and I'll try briefly to sketch these out for you. Medical ethics, nothing new. The Prophet very much emphasized the importance of a healthy lifestyle. He recommended certain types of sport. He recommended moderation in all things in eating. He also laid down a whole medical code, which Hakim knows a lot about, called prophetic medicine, Tibb an-Nabawi, which uses things like herbal remedies and so forth. Still very important in the Muslim world. The modern world started to disturb this pattern, first of all, 200 or 300 years ago with the introduction of tobacco. Obviously not mentioned in the Quran and the Hadith, so what was the Islamic ruling on tobacco? Was it permissible or forbidden? The fairly important words for these two things are, I'll try and fit them in here. Halal means, not very literate today, halal, and haram, like kosher and non-kosher, permissible, impermissible, pure, impure, lawful, unlawful. So is tobacco halal or is it haram? Well, for many years the jurists thought that there was no problem. And the reason why was that it wasn't prohibited, and the established settled principle of Islamic law is that if something is not explicitly prohibited in the Quran and the Sunnah, it must be regarded as lawful. In the present century, however, researchers have shown that tobacco has very negative health ramifications. And so we find in 1966, the Al-Azhar University in Cairo issuing its first fatwa on the subject. I'll quote to you the text of the fatwa so you'll see how these things are written. Sheikh Mahmoud Shaltut, who was the head of the Azhar at that time, said, "Tobacco is not intoxicating and does not cause damage to the mind." Remember, Islam prohibits alcohol because it damages, interferes with that which makes us human, namely the intellect. So he says it's not intoxicating, however, it has deleterious effects on the health of both smokers and non-smokers. Doctors have analysed its elements and identified a toxic constituent which ruins the happiness and pleasure of man. Causing damage is, in the view of Islam, an abomination. Furthermore, amounts of money are spent on it, which very often the smoker could use otherwise in more useful and productive directions. For this reason, smoking has aspects which, in the eyes of the Shari'ah, require that it be prevented and not permitted. This was the first fatwa using this principle of ijtihad, independent reasoning, that prohibited the consumption of tobacco. Muslims still smoke a lot, regrettably, but the Shari'ah position is really quite clear. The government's position in Egypt was fairly indifferent to this. Their view was that since alcohol, obviously a worse evil than tobacco, since it can lead to violent behavior, is allowed in Egypt because the religious minorities and the tourists want it. So how can we ban tobacco, which is so much less damaging than alcohol? So it's still legal in Egypt, and even in Saudi Arabia. I don't think there's a single Muslim country that bans tobacco. So the smoking issue is a fairly simple one as far as the fatwas are concerned. Similarly clear have been the recent pronouncements on AIDS. Since about 1985, it started to impinge on the Muslim conscience. Obviously, Muslim societies tend to be fairly close-knit and stable. There is not much sex outside or before marriage. And generally, AIDS is not a problem of the proportions that it has started to assume in some other parts of the world. But the Mufti is looking at this, say this is a simple moral one. People have violated God's law by having sexual contact outside marriage or by using intravenous drugs, and the Shari'ah is there to protect people. So it's not seen as a divine punishment. It's seen as the entailment of rejecting God's protection. The Shari'ah is there to protect people. If you cast it aside, then what is beyond it will get you. And they justify this view by citing a hadith which runs, "Never shall immoral behaviour appear among a people to the extent that they make it public, but there shall appear among them plagues and agonies unknown to their forefathers." So this new social phenomenon has not generally caused much soul-searching or disquiet amongst the jurists. In fact, AIDS is, predictably enough, a favourite sermon topic now in the Muslim world. Did you have a question?
In regard to AIDS, what about in cases when, like through blood transfusion or something, when it's
Right.
completely not known to you?
I've not seen them addressing that. They would just regard it as a tragic misfortune. But the perception is that overwhelmingly it's the result of moral turpitude. So AIDS has not presented major difficulties. Rather more sharp and perhaps more interesting has been the debate over abortion. A debate which has cropped up particularly in recent years and came to the fore at the 1994 UN Population Conference, which was held in Cairo. How has the Sharia coped with the question of abortion? Obviously, it's more or less as old as the human species itself. Nowadays, it presents itself in a new and rather intensified form. There's a lot of pressure on many societies and families to control birth rates. Also, medical procedures have made it a lot safer than it was in the past, when the operation was often almost as dangerous to the mother as it was to the fetus. Medieval Islamic law discusses abortion in some detail. All of the madhabs agreed that a fetus with a soul had exactly the same rights as any other human being, so that in Islamic law, a miscarried fetus with a soul has to be given a name, and it has to have the full funeral prayer over it, and it has to be given a normal Muslim burial in a proper graveyard. The question was, what defines an ensouled human being? And most of the jurists held that the moment of ensoulment, nafh ruh, which is the Quranic term, the breathing in of the spirit, when God breathes the soul into the child, takes place in the 16th week of pregnancy. And the usual proof text here is a hadith that runs, "Each one of you has his creation gathered in his mother's womb for 40 days. Then he becomes a clot for a like period. Then he becomes a piece of flesh. Then God sends the angel who breathes in the spirit." So to these jurists, it seemed clear that abortion before that age, before the 16th week of pregnancy, is actually halal, it's permissible, although it may not be performed if it endangers the life of the mother. The jurists compare abortion to violence, abortion to the crushing of a date stone. They say, if you crush a date stone, that's not the same as uprooting a palm tree. There's no moral equivalence. There's an exception in the Maliki jurists who say that the ensoulment deadline of 16 weeks can only be inferred from this hadith, but the issue is so fundamentally important that one needs more solid evidence, preferably something from the Quran, and as that's not forthcoming, abortion at any age must be prohibited entirely. There are secondary arguments in Islamic law over whether the abortion has to have the consent of both parents. Most jurists say yes, it does, but the Hanafis say, for instance, that a woman is entitled to abort a fetus without her husband's permission. Once ensoulment has taken place, an abortion is only permissible if the pregnancy endangers the mother's life. So that's the classical position. Number of books which you can look at, quite interesting ones on the subject, if you want to learn more. So medieval Islam has a fairly clear-cut set of answers on abortion. Basically, before the 16th week, it's fine. So why should it be a contemporary issue? Well, strangely, it has become the subject of a very bitter debate in the past 10 years or so. Interestingly, we find some ulama challenging the medieval tolerance of it and proposing its complete or almost complete prohibition. So at this UN conference in 1994 in Cairo, we saw the spectacle of the Vatican delegation working with many Muslim scholars in order to insert key clauses in the final declaration in order to safeguard, as they put it, the life of the unborn child. So it's strange that the classical position seems to have been overturned. What's happened is that although the classical arguments are still respected, the ulama are arguing. Did I tell you what ulama means? Probably not. Ulama means scholars, those who know, experts in law and doctrine. So the ulama say, yes, we accept and respect the classical arguments. However, times have changed. There is a danger that the easy availability of abortion will lead to Western-style promiscuity. There's also a suspicion that the Western countries are anxious at what they see as the Muslim baby boom and are supporting abortion in Muslim countries as part of a kind of conspiracy against the Muslim world. So interestingly enough, we find that in most Muslim countries, abortion is actually forbidden, and the anti-abortion legislation brought into places like Egypt by the former colonial powers ignore Islamic law on this respect. In this respect, in Egypt, abortion is actually illegal, except in a few exceptions like rape or risks to the mother's health. A number of other things I had to say about abortion. Perhaps I'll skate over those. Let me talk a bit about contraception. Another classic argument in medical ethics. Again, the medieval scholars generally tolerated contraceptive methods, although they frowned on abortifacients, i.e. those methods that work by displacing a fertilized egg. They said that they weren't forbidden, but it's distasteful to use such methods. The arguments in favor of contraception cite a number of hadiths in which the Prophet authorized the use of coitus interruptus, but these are deployed as supplementary evidence. Ghazali, the great medieval scholar who defined the classical position on this issue, grounded his argument mainly in maslaha, which you recall means public interest, medical and economic arguments. He says that according to the anatomists, the human form only takes shape following fertilization, hence to destroy a male or female seed has no moral significance. And this contrasts with medieval European understandings. In Europe, arguments were derived from the Bible, which, unlike the Quran, does refer to contraception, particularly the famous passage in Genesis 38. But European arguments were also borrowing from medicine, and this was dominated by Aristotle's notion of how conception took place. For Aristotle, it was the male seed that was all important. It was the male seed that contained the pneuma, the spirit, and that the female egg was merely a passive soil and had no positive role in the determination of the child. And some Europeans even held that each sperm contained a complete human being in miniature. So the role of the woman in this Aristotelian view is purely passive. Hence, to terminate the sperm in any way was considered to be a form of murder. And Aquinas and the medieval church tradition unanimously hold this. The Muslims, however, had inherited a rather different version of the Greek tradition, specifically that associated with Galen. Galen said that fertilization entails a more or less equal contribution from both the male and the female. And this Galenic view was reinforced and conceivably even influenced the relevant body of hadiths. So we find the Prophet saying, "Man is created of both, the semen of the man and the semen of the woman. The man's semen forms the bones and tendons, the woman's semen forms the flesh and the blood." So medieval Islam recognized legitimate theological and medical arguments in favor of most forms of contraception. There were also economic and social arguments that were deployed. Modern conditions in many ways have actually strengthened these medieval arguments. And in most Muslim countries today, contraceptives are very freely available. In Iran, for instance, they're dished out for free by the state. However, again, in some Muslim countries, there has been a slow shifting away from the medieval position, again because of the claim that the ready availability of these things leads to premarital sex and hence endangers the family. So it's an interesting case, and not unique, of the impact of modernity actually pushing Muslim societies into a more conservative rather than a more liberal and perhaps up-to-date view. Let me talk about a few other issues in medical ethics very briefly. Artificial insemination, again a live issue now in the Muslim world. Fertility is highly esteemed in Islamic cultures, as it is in all traditional cultures. Infertility is a calamity which challenges one's place in the order of society. Traditional Muslim societies did recognize that infertility could be a male as well as a female problem. In a hadith, we find the Prophet reproaching a man who had not informed his wife of his sterility prior to marriage. The hadith goes on to tell us that the Prophet then gave the woman the right to divorce him if she chose. The desire for fertility is also intensified by the Quran's prohibition on adoption. You can foster a child, and indeed this is strongly recommended as a virtuous act, but adoption, i.e. bringing up another's children as if they were one's own, giving them one's own surname, is seen as a threat to genetic integrity and a denial of the natural father's rights, and hence the Quran prohibits adoption. So against this background, it's fairly unsurprising that in Muslim cultures nowadays there's very lively interest in the question of artificial insemination, and the ulama exercising this principle of ijtihad have worked quite hard. Sometimes they found themselves palpably bewildered by the difficulties because of the rapid changes in medical science. Even in the West, obviously, many of these issues have not been satisfactorily resolved, either by religious or secular ethical thinkers. Test tube babies, surrogate motherhood, lesbian parenthood. Many of these things are still live issues, and it's not entirely clear what the final consensus is going to be. In the Muslim world, these arguments have been a lot more sharp, and the results have generally been, to date, a lot more cautious. Let me give an example of the famous Baby M case. 1986, you've all heard of this first surrogate motherhood case. A surrogate mother was artificially inseminated from a married father, accepted payment on the understanding that the child would be handed over to the biological father and his wife. The surrogate mother then decided she wanted to keep the child, and one of America's longest legal battles ensued, resolved after only 32 court sessions. A reminder of how intractable these contemporary issues are. I think the judge finally decided that the contract had been invalid, but he allowed the natural mother to keep the child. I think that was how it fell out. How does Islamic law deal with this? Well, actually, in the Muslim press, there was a lot of interest in the Baby M case. The jurists typically have invoked two principles in this discussion. First of all, classical Sharia textbooks acknowledge the possibility of pregnancy without actual physical contact. There are discussions, for instance, on a woman who fertilizes herself with seed that she believes to be her husband's, but in fact was not. Slightly freakish circumstance, for instance, but it's there in the classical text of Islamic law. And it says if she conceives as a result of a genuine error of this kind, then she's not committing a sin. Secondly, the jurists recognize that there is simply nothing in the Quran or the Hadith that suggests that conception is only religiously sanctioned if it takes place in the usual biological way. They also assume that bringing about pregnancy through a means other than sexual contact is not an interference with the Creator's acts or an attempt to change his decision that a given couple will not have children. The egg and sperm are God's creation, and how they come together is not of fundamental religious significance. If God wishes a couple to be infertile, after all, they're going to be infertile, whatever means they might employ to try and circumvent his decree. So using these two arguments, following the principle of ijtihad, the use of the mind to work out new Sharia rulings, the jurists have overwhelmingly accepted the validity of artificial insemination in Islamic law. The conditions are: A, the sperm must belong to the husband; B, it must be transferred to his own wife; C, they must be neither divorced nor separated. Artificial insemination from another man, from a donor bank, for instance, is regarded as forbidden. There's also an argument now which has been quite lively in England over whether artificial insemination is permissible in Islam, halal, if the husband is deceased. And in Britain we had this controversy a few months ago when an English woman failed in the courts to compel a hospital to inseminate her with her late husband's semen. Islamic authorities have debated this, and as yet there are no very clear or unanimous results. In 1988 we find a fatwa coming from Egypt which rules that a wife may in fact use the seed of her deceased husband in this way. And this provoked quite a bit of opposition, particularly from a theologian at Beirut called Muhammad Shalabi, who insisted that only a young widow may have such a right. An older woman should be denied it because she needs to have a husband around. He also expressed the fear that women might choose to become pregnant in this way as a kind of poetic gesture of fidelity to a late husband, rather than out of real consideration for the kind of life such a child might lead without a father. Shalabi also notes, again using this principle of ijtihad, that the Islamic law of estate division, dishing out one's inheritance following one's demise, is greatly complicated by posthumous births of this kind. If a child is born 10 years after his father's death, he's going to be denied any inheritance because the inheritance has already been distributed. So one of his fundamental rights is being denied. So Shalabi concludes that posthumous insemination is haram, religiously unlawful. This is not an official fatwa from an accredited institution. Nonetheless, this view has now gained wide currency, and as yet it's simply impossible to predict where the consensus, the ijma', is going to lie. I think that we are scheduled to end at 12, and I've already outstayed my welcome. There are a number of other issues that I thought I might bring up relating to medical ethics, questions of genetic engineering, for instance. in vitro fertilization. But hopefully what I have discussed briefly is sufficient to show not just the interesting arguments that are taking place over these contemporary issues, but also to remind us that Islamic law is not a static, fixed, closed, medieval corpus of rulings, but is something that does have a demonstrable capacity through consensus and debate and argument to provide morally coherent but still Quranically sensitive guidance for contemporary issues undreamed of by the medievals. That essentially is all I wanted to say for today's lecture. Tomorrow I'll be holding forth on the other two dimensions of Islam mentioned in the hadith of Gabriel. Iman, namely faith, what Muslims believe, that is Muslim theology, and then the highest degree of ihsan, spiritual excellence, which includes the spiritual life, mysticism, some aspects of Islamic sacred art. Anyway, we have no time for questions whatsoever, which is probably just as well. I can escape your interrogations, but no doubt there'll be opportunities over lunch.